Hi, this is Jenny from the Sewing Palace. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to make a 12-inch finished block using our Saturday Sampler online quilt-along pattern. It's called Santa's Village by Thimble Creek Quilts. Today's block is 12 inches finished and it's got some fun components in it. Let's talk about the components in the block. So this is a 12-inch finished block. The grid on it is a 2-inch grid. So there's 2, 4, this is a double grid here, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. So these little guys are 2 inches finished, which means they measure 2.5 unfinished. And these ones are 4.5 because it's a double grid. So you either have 2-inch finished units or 4-inch finished units. When you sew them all together, you'll have a 12-inch finished block. If you have an AccuQuilt cutter, the center square and these green squares are cut at 4.5, and these outside corner squares are cut at 2.5, and these half square triangle units are finished at 2 inches. So there is a die for all of those things. Let's collect a couple of supplies. You'll need some fabrics. So we have those 3 fabrics for this block. You'll also need a fabric-friendly pen because we need to mark some lines on the back of the fabric. This one irons away. It's the Frixion pin. And then I have a rotary cutter. This is a Quilter Select rotary cutter. It's nice and heavy. You can use it right-handed or left-handed, and it's a wonderful cutter. You'll need a couple rulers. So I use a strip cutter. This is a 3.5 by 12.5, very comfortable to hold. I also have a square ruler. One of my favorites is the 6.5-inch square from Creative Grids. And then you'll need one specialty ruler if you want to square up your half square triangles. So I have either used the Bloc-loc 4.5-inch, and I'll show you how to use that, or you can also use the Bloc-loc 2.5-inch half square triangle specialty ruler. You want some starch. I have a mixture of Terial Magic and Best Press in a mister bottle, so I have that. I also have the woolly pressing mat, which I love to press. It gets my seams nice and flat. Some scissors, some thread, a wonderful sewing machine. I'm sewing today on my lovely Bernina Tula Pink 350. I love this machine. And you'll just get ready to start sewing. Cutting the fabrics. You'll want to choose some fabrics for your block. This is my background fabric and my 2 contrasting colors that will make up the components of the block. I've also starched the fabric with some starch, and my starch is a combination of Terial Magic and Best Press. I use 2/3 amount of Best Press and 1/3 amount of Terial Magic. I spray it pretty heavily and then let it dry and iron it. So then my fabric has a nice hand to it and is nicely starched. So I'm going to get ready to start cutting the components. In the directions, it will have some cutting instructions, and I'm going to deviate a little bit with making the half square triangle units. The half square triangle units are cutting 2 7/8, and then you mark on the diagonal, sew on each side, and then open it up, and it should measure 2.5, which is 2 inches finished. I'm going to use a trick, which is making 8 at a time. So whenever I'm looking at these units, I'm going to plan on doing 8 at a time. So to do that, and I want a 2-inch finished unit, I know that the cut square for 8 at a time half square triangle is going to be a 6-inch square of my background and a 6-inch square of my contrasting fabric. For this one, it's going to be 6 inches of red and 6 inches of cream. The 8 at a time half square triangle trick I'm using from the Bloc-loc ruler company, and those will be 6 inches for 2-inch finished. This is my cream background fabric. I've laid it right side up, and then my red contrasting fabric, I've laid it right side down, and then I'm going to cut a square out of each that is 6 inches. From the red fabric, I will cut 1 4.5-inch square for the center, and then 4 2.5-inch squares for components of the block. I now need 4 2.5-inch squares, so I'm going to use double widths. I'm now ready to cut some more cream fabric. Out of the background or the cream fabric, I will need 12 2.5-inch squares. So I'm going to fold my fabric so that I have multiple layers, and I'll use a strip cutter to line up at the bottom of the ruler, and I'll cut strips that are 2.5 inches. I'll see how many I get out of the first strip. I'm now ready to cut my green fabric, and that fabric is 4.5-inch squares. So I'm going to fold it so that I have 4 layers and cut 4 squares out of that. So let's review. Out of our green contrasting fabric, I have 4 4.5-inch squares. Out of my cream fabric, I have 12 2.5-inch squares and a 6.5-inch square. Out of my red, I have a 4.5-inch square for the center and 4 4.5-inch squares of red. For my 8 at a time half square triangles, I have 2 6-inch squares. I'm going to take a ruler and mark diagonally from point to point. After that, we'll get ready to sew. We're going to sew our 8 at a time half square triangles. We've marked our squares diagonally. They're laying right sides together, and we're going to sew on each side of each marked line. Cutting this square apart, we're going to first cut it in half so that that cut intersects that center line. This square was cut at 6 inches, so the center point is 3, so up and down 3 inches, and then horizontal cut, so that will also be down the center at 3 inches. After that's cut, you're then going to cut on the diagonal lines that you marked. What that yields is 8 half square triangle units. We'll go over to the ironing board and press those open so that the dark fabric is towards the red. For your 8 half square triangle units, you'll want to square these up so that they measure 2.5. If you have a Bloc-loc ruler that is actually 2.5 inches, you can use that ruler. The seam that you've pressed it to will be the dark. If you can read your ruler, it will lock into place properly, and then it will lay flat on your fabric so it won't teeter-totter, and then you'll square all the way around the square. If you don't have a Bloc-loc ruler that is exactly 2.5, you can use a larger ruler. This is a 4.5-inch square ruler that is by Bloc-loc. It's a half square triangle ruler. Again, the seam will be facing you. You'll lock that into the seam, then you'll slide the ruler over. I'm going to be trimming just a little bit on the right side and the top. After I trim that side, I'll then rotate the block, lock the ruler back into place onto the seam so that it's facing the dark, and slide that to the measurement of 2.5. This is a 2-inch finished half square triangle, so I'm going to be cutting it at 2.5. We're now ready to get the green component together. For each green component, you'll need 1 green square and 2 cream squares. On the wrong side of the fabric, you'll mark a line diagonally from point to point, and you'll use this diagonal line on your ruler, and it will intersect the top and the bottom if you've cut a perfect square. It's a nice way to double check that you've cut a nice square. For each pair of cream colored background fabrics, you'll need to mark the backs. So you'll do that 4 separate times. Then what you'll do is you'll line one up so that it intersects the outside edges. And you're going to sew right along that line. Once you've sewn your 4 squares with the green, you'll then want to trim them down. When you flip these out, this edge should still measure 4.5 inches. If you flip it out and your seam wasn't right on that line, sometimes you'll have a small amount that needs to be trimmed or that might be a little short. So you want to square up your blocks to 4.5. The other thing you want to do is trim away this excess underneath. Then you'll take your pieces that you've already marked and they'll lay the opposite direction. So outside edge to outside edge, and you'll sew along that line. For your green squares that you sewed the other half, you've trimmed away the excess on the first step, and then on this step you're going to trim this down so that's 1/4 inch. Then once you trim it down, you'll want to make sure your block is square at 4.5. So a trim and double check the square. To check that this 1/4 inch reveal is there is you can take a Bloc-loc ruler and lock that into the seam, and this is a 2x4 finished flying geese ruler. Once I lock that into the seam, I can then square up my ruler to make sure it is even from this edge, possibly trim any of this or this side. But that's a nice way to check your measurements so that you know that they're square. This is Jenny from the Sewing Palace in Helena, Montana. We have lots of fun videos on our YouTube channel, so you gotta like and subscribe those. I'm glad you joined me in my sewing room today. It was fun to have you. We'd love to see you in the shop. We're in Helena, Montana. Bye-bye.